All right, well, it's my pleasure as the Director of the Humanities Center to welcome you all to this brown bag. I'm Jamie Goodrich, and today, as you all know, we will be hearing a talk by Layla Saatchi, who is a fabulous friend of the center, and whose talks are always very much anticipated. So I'll give a brief biography that she's given me, and then I will let her take it away. In 2007, she completed her master's degree in Near East languages and was invited to author a chapter in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Women in Islam. After teaching full-time in the CMLLC program for 3 years, she decided to complete her PhD in philosophy, and she defended her dissertation, where she developed a novel theory for reasonable disagreement, and then applied that theory to the persistent debate concerning whether Islam requires women to cover their hair, concluding that there are grounds for reasonable disagreement, and where there are grounds, it is unreasonable and unjust for states like the Islamic Republic of Iran to impose a rule requiring women to cover their hair based on Islam. As a fellow with the Academic Leadership Academy, she recently launched a civil discourse initiative on campus that interrogates the boundaries of civil discourse and how and when to engage in civil discourse and when it is better not to. The graduates of this program will receive a certificate of completion and designation as Wayne State Civil Discourse Ambassadors. That's such important work, and I'm pleased the Humanities Center has helped sponsor that. She also received a summer grant in 2023 to develop a new course on the philosophy of work, which she will be teaching for the first time this semester. And today she's talking about, she's giving a talk entitled Epistemic Fragility and Colorblind Reasoning. So welcome.
Thank you. Wow, listening to that, I realize why I'm so tired. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here. And thank you, Jamie and Ariel, and the Humanities Center for their support for this project. I want to begin by saying something that is uncharacteristic of philosophers. I want to tell you that this talk I'm giving is motivated by fear. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to be under the false impression that as a philosopher, I'm somehow, taking an objective, analytical stand, looking at things from outside. But actually, I'm really fearful, as I think many of you likely are. I'm fearful of what can come from the persistent and increasing political polarization, evidenced by all of our polling, academic studies, and anecdotal experiences. There is not one source saying, good news, latest polls show a decrease in political polarization. And add to this, the rising ubiquity of AI-generated deepfakes, narcissistic social media algorithms, and growing mistrust of higher education and education in general. All this together, you have this recipe for persistently deepening social and political polarization. So let's be totally like, okay, so now we can back going. My fear, which I think many of you probably find some affinity, is well-founded and is also a source of great motivation and inspiration. This leads me to the following working thesis, that social and political polarization is fueled by a human condition I call epistemic fragility. Building on Robin DiAngelo's descriptive claim that white fragility is a sociology of dominance, characterized by a rejection of seeing oneself and society in racial terms, my hypothesis is that epistemic fragility is similarly an epistemology of dominance, characterized by a rejection of evidence that would give someone good reason to doubt the accuracy with which they see themselves in society, which in the case of colorblind reasoning results in seeing themselves and society in non-racial terms. So as we go on, I will give further definitions of colorblind reasoning. The question for us at this point then has to do with the nature of this rejection. Are there good epistemic grounds for rejecting certain evidence? Before I get into that, I think it's important to add some clarification which I think comes on the next slide. I hope. Yes. Okay. So, because I borrowed this phrasing of epistemic fragility from Robin DiAngelo, who is a sociologist, I believe, who writes from a standpoint that has already decided what counts as good evidence. So Robin DiAngelo has made this estimation, and she's also decided what we ought to conclude from that evidence. Since I'm going to be advancing a philosophical argument, I want to be sensitive to the assumptions I make, and I want to be careful not to fall prey to circularity. Like many analytic philosophers, I think of evidence as a two-place relation. So P is evidence for Q, has three components, P, Q, and the relation of is evidence for, where P and Q are two thoughts with propositional content rattling around in my mind until such time as I recognize that P holds an evidential relation to Q. That process of connecting P and Q, in my view, connecting P and Q in this evidential relation is a form of reasoning where I would conclude from P that Q. Okay. So for instance, imagine that you've observed me walking down Gullen Mall at noon. From that observation, you formed the thought that Layla walked down Gullen Mall at noon. Let's call that P1. Perfect. P1, and separately, you also have background knowledge and memory. Let's say that Layla's scheduled to give a talk at the Humanities Center at 12:30 p.m. on Monday. Let's call that P2. So when Mark asks you at 1 p.m. whether you know where Layla is, after a moment of reflection, you say, oh, yeah, she's at the Humanities Center. In that moment, you reason from P1 and P2 to the conclusion that Layla's at the Humanities Center now, and that reasoning process assigned an evidential relationship between those two propositions. Layla walked down Gullen Mall at noon, and Layla's giving a talk at the Humanities Center at 12:30 p.m. on Monday, and the concluding proposition that she's at the Humanities Center now. Of course, there's a lot of other stuff going on in the background too, like your belief that it is in fact Monday, right? But that's neither here nor there. The point is that we go in our reasoning, we connect these propositions with this evidential relationship. So if you have some higher order belief that an idea or thought is in some sense evidenced for something, then it would be irrational to reject that relationship. It will be a sort of cognitive dissonance. With this in mind, let's modify the question slightly because it will be important for what I'm going to say later about standpoint theory and coherentism. So we can go to the next slide. Right. So the question is modified like so. Are there good epistemic grounds for rejecting an evidential relationship between thoughts, ideas, memories, experiences, and other propositional content holders? So do we have grounds for rejecting that evidential relationship that we create or might create? Generally speaking, the answer is yes. We may have good grounds for rejecting this relation on the basis of inconsistency with existing beliefs or on the basis of the reliability of the information. Sometimes reliability is determined by way of the information's consistency with existing beliefs, and sometimes by way of the reliability of the source or sources of information themselves. So we're immediately faced with some potential epistemic pitfalls. For instance, the grounds upon which we judge whether evidence is reliable can be prejudiced or mired with bias, such as if our existing set of beliefs are based on bad information, then using these pre-existing beliefs to judge the evidential quality of further information may bias us against new information. So, recognizing whether an evidential relationship exists between our thoughts, memories, perceptions, or beliefs is a necessary part of our reasoning and is also prone to errors in judgment. More significantly for my work, however, is the reasoning role that coherence and consistency play within individual standpoints that I argue contribute to epistemic fragility. So now let's come back to my initial hypothesis. Social and political polarization is fueled by a human condition I'm calling epistemic fragility, where epistemic fragility is characterized by a rejection of the evidential worth of certain thoughts, memories, perceptions, beliefs, and testimonies. I further suggest that colorblind reasoning is an instance of epistemic fragility. Can you go to the next slide? So in what follows, I'm going to play a short clip from a debate on affirmative action hosted by the Federalist Society, and which I take to be a typical example of colorblind reasoning. After playing the clip, I'll use it to illustrate how psychosocial standpoint and the epistemic virtue of coherence can contribute to the persistence of polarization. So as you watch and listen to Professor Fitzgerald, who's a law professor at Vanderbilt, and Professor Kennedy, who's a law professor at Harvard, I want you to imagine what background beliefs, experiences, memories, and thoughts might be going on as these two intellectuals engage in this discourse. One further piece of information that can be helpful: the debate is taking place in May 2023, which is just a month before the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action in June 2023.
I want to rephrase one of the audience questions and add some data to it. According to the most recent data available, fewer than 100 African Americans a year score as high as 170 on the LSAT, which suggests that an admissions process based on quantitative measures that doesn't account for race would leave top law schools with fewer no African Americans, or Harvard would sweep them all up and the rest of the top 15 wouldn't have any. Is that a problem as a legitimacy matter? Is there a solution to that problem that you would find acceptable as a constitutional matter?
Is it a problem? You know, it's frankly not a problem for me. And when we talk about legitimacy, you know, this is legitimacy that has been influenced by decades of propaganda about diversity being necessary for legitimacy. And I reject that premise. I just do not think that racial diversity should be seen as necessary for legitimacy. I think what makes an institution most legitimate is if it has the best and the brightest people there, not people that fill out a certain color mosaic. And, you know, this is a problem that I just have over and over again with the diversity argument, is if we really want these different perspectives, these different viewpoints, why don't we make efforts to actually get the viewpoints and the perspectives? Why are we using skin color instead of going directly to what we say that we want? And I think that the question just presumes that what we're after here is not the educational benefits of diversity, Ted, because what we're after here is this window dressing again. We need window dressing in order to make people happy, not educational benefits. Because if we wanted educational benefits, we would go to the things that produce those benefits, the diversity of ideas, the diversity of perspectives. And I'm just curious, you know, if Professor Kennedy favors using preferences for conservatives when you're hiring faculty over there at Harvard. I mean, if conservatives are as underrepresented there as I suspect they are, why aren't you guys using the same efforts to boost those numbers that you use for the races that you think are underrepresented?
Couple things. Number one, remember your starting point. Your starting point is that a lot of the diversity talk is pretextual. And I agree. I think a lot of it is pretextual. Do I think that there is something to some diversity is there something going on there that on the edges should be taken into account? My view is yes. So ideologically, yeah, if somebody is, has a very different ideological vantage or methodological vantage, I'd say, yeah, we've got a really good this one, we got a really good this one, we don't have a really good that one. So let's get that one. So the idea of, sort of making a special effort, outreach, special recruitment, special, having an eye out for somebody who is ideologically an outlier, fine by me. I want to say one last thing with respect to the person who asked that question, because I think that this is a tough one. The person who asked the question basically said, listen, there's this gap, quite dramatic gap. What do we do about it? Now, I think that in some quarters, that gap is very threatening. I mean, we live in a society where the idea of that Black people are, intellectually inferior to white people is a congenital matter. That's still out there. There are millions of people who think that. And I think that when you start talking about the gap, I think people get really nervous. And I think that a lot of people really want to sort of put that under the rug. They don't want to deal with it. They just, let's just, let's turn the page. I think that the issue of the gap, and by the way, I think there is one. I don't doubt that there is. And I don't think that there should be any mystery as to why there is such a gap. I mean, for over 100 years, it was a crime to teach Black people literacy. It was a felony. And, after that, Black people were systematically deprived of educational resources, and then they were, impoverished, and this and that and the other. Does this have consequences that show up in the sort of gap that the questioner mentioned? Yes. I think that gap should be faced, and I don't think it should be swept under the rug. And I think we should do things, what do we do about that? Now, what we do about it, I'm not sure, frankly. And I think we should discuss it and, and maybe experiment.
So he's in favor of social experimenting. That's not the subject of this discussion. So you might be asking yourself, how can these two clearly well-informed and highly educated people who seem to be sharing the same relevant information be so far apart ideologically? I should also say that Professor Fitzgerald was Professor Kennedy's law student at Harvard. Okay, so the simple answer is that they're not. They're just not sharing all the same information. Because if we assign evidential relations based on memories, perceptions, and existing beliefs, then surely these two professors are coming at this question of affirmative action from very, very different standpoints. Each of them carries, to borrow from Peggy McIntosh, their own invisible knapsacks. Today, we talk about the invisible knapsack in terms of standpoints. The structures that contribute to and reinforce gender, sexuality, and racial norms that affect our experiences and how we think about them. So for instance, that I can walk out of a store with my purchase without worrying that I'll be stopped by security if I don't put my purchase in a shopping bag or get a receipt is a privilege and makes it hard, not impossible, for me to understand what it's like to be under scrutiny like that. Likewise, someone who has never given birth can't know what it's like. Finally, philosophy is recognizing that these standpoints are epistemically relevant. Psychology has been for decades. Sociology has for decades. Finally, philosophy is on board. You may also have noticed that I use the term understand in the first instance and know in the second. Not because I think they're interchangeable. Understanding and knowing are very different things. I can never know what it's like to be under criminal scrutiny because of my race. I can, however, locate some understanding through my own experiences. Likewise, though a man can never know what it's like to give birth to another human being, they can try to understand. Standpoint theory has the potential for motivating a certain epistemic humility. So why aren't the professors willing to come to an understanding? I argue that to do so would compromise the coherence of their position. Recall again, you're going to be so sick of this. Recall again that epistemic fragility is characterized by a rejection of the evidential worth of certain thoughts, memories, perceptions, beliefs, and testimonies. It's not that Professor Fitzgerald doesn't know about the achievement gap, right? He does. He just doesn't assign any evidential worth to it. Professor Fitzgerald says that the achievement gap, isn't important for him. And I take him at his word. It really isn't. Because his standpoint is informed by what Charles Mills refers to as the racial contract. One that operates as a racially exclusionary, higher order contract that white folks have tacitly agreed to in order to maintain a diminished social and economic status for non-whites. Given the structure, of course, given the structure of this racial contract, of course there would be an achievement gap for minorities. Eduardo Bonilla Silva would call this a cultural explanation for the racial disparity between non-whites and whites. Professor Fitzgerald then does not associate an evidential relation between the fact of achievement gaps along racial lines and the need to actively promote diversity, equity, and inclusion in colleges. Moreover, these structures of conservative white normativity motivate an evidential relation between what is important for him, namely the silencing of conservative views under what he takes to be the guise or facade of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In his experience, and if you're interested, I can provide the link to you. It's really fascinating, what he says. So in his experience, inclusive efforts on campuses are resulting in the exclusion of conservative views, and he believes this is wrong. Professor Fitzgerald has an unstated argument running in the background, the conclusion of which resonates with supporters of former President Trump. The argument goes something like this. If universities are disingenuous about their desire for real diversity and inclusion, which he thinks they are, and instead are interested only in liberal social engineering and ideological supremacy, which he thinks they are, so much the worse for conservative cisgender white men and white supremacy overall. In Professor Fitzgerald's experience, the antecedent condition is satisfied, and since his position is a coherent one, it seems to have epistemic worth. But what you might be thinking is, now hold on, isn't Professor Fitzgerald a paradigmatic example of what Charles Mills takes to be someone who has tacitly bought into the racial contract? And isn't he engaging in colorblind reasoning when he dismisses the evidential worth of achievement gaps along racial lines? The answer is yes, on all accounts. This is what he's doing. This is what colorblind reasoning amounts to. And this is how epistemic fragility gives rise to colorblind reasoning. But here's what I want to conclude, and then we can open it up for questions, and I look forward to your questions and comments. We tend to think that coherence is a good thing. In psychology and epistemology and in our research, no matter what discipline, coherence is a virtue. It's a good thing. We think that for something to be true, it should be at least coherent, meaning that a proposition ought to be in a supportive relationship and be consistent with our existing beliefs. So it is necessary for a belief to be true that it stands in a coherent relationship with a set of beliefs or with a set of propositions that we hold to be true. But taken too far, coherence can be exclusionary, as we see with Professor Fitzgerald. But I hasten to add that it is not only limited to conservative viewpoints. Maximally coherent positions that maximally privilege certain standpoints are pervasive within conservative and liberal discourse. And this is what I think is contributing to epistemic fragility, and what I think is contributing to our persistent and increasing polarity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Layla. Questions for the speaker?
Layla,
Yay.
thanks.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, my pleasure. Glad to be here. So, I take it, let me first see. if
Let me
I'm
get a
tracking
pen.
things.
Hold on.
Yeah, let me see if I'm tracking some things, and then if I've
Yes.
sort of got the account right,
Go
the
ahead.
question will fall out of that. Okay, so part of what you're going for here is, the epistemically fragile person is going to retain a certain sort of epistemic good-making property, namely a coherence between their beliefs.
Right.
And maybe they're sort of actually overinflating the importance of the coherence of the beliefs. And part of how their beliefs stay coherent is by not letting certain things into the belief set, right? Presumably that's part of what's going on with this definition. So I was wondering if you could sort of walk through in sort of a bit more of an applied fashion, maybe in the case of Fitzgerald, when you say there are certain thoughts, beliefs, perceptions, etc., that sort of are being discounted or aren't being put into the belief set, can you say kind of what that looks like in concrete? Does that make sense?
Yes. So Professor Fitzgerald is of the view that, and Kennedy said this at the outset too, that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in universities are facades. They are just, I think, window dressing, he says, that there's no genuine interest in promoting diversity on campus, equity on campus, inclusion on campus for the purposes of advancing understanding, of improving education. So he starts from this assumption, but that assumption has a foundation, and that foundation is his experiences of exclusion. So earlier in the video, he gives this example of how, I think it was at Stanford, there was a judge who was not allowed to come and speak because the judge's position was that we shouldn't use different pronouns or something along those lines. And I guess the public position of this judge that had been invited to Stanford was offensive to members of the Stanford campus who were non-binary. And they didn't want him to come and speak on campus for this reason, because of his positions that were clearly offensive to them. So on Fitzgerald's view, denying this judge to come and speak on campus was a silencing. And the silencing was motivated, on Fitzgerald's view, was motivated by this desire to be more inclusive. And Fitzgerald is saying, well, the inclusion of people should not result in the exclusion of others. So that's just one example. So his belief that campuses are not promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion, that it's just window dressing, is based on these experiences of exclusion that he's had. And so these experiences are far more significant for him than his, the thoughts, his understanding, the sort of factual information about achievement gaps. He doesn't deny that there are achievement gaps. They're there. But those achievement gaps don't motivate his view to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion on campuses, and by extension, affirmative action. But rather, he says, if we really believe in these things, if we really believe in these values, we should be promoting diverse viewpoints, right? And forget about color. Does that help? I know I didn't do it in sort of a formal way.
If people would permit, can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Follow up? Would you mind putting the definition of epistemic fragility back up? So it seems to me, part of what was interesting about your response. So in the definition here, we've got epistemic fragility characterized by rejection of evidence that would give some good reason to doubt. I'm wondering actually if part of what's going on is the total.
I'm sorry. Let me go down. This is the original definition that is a little bit problematic.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's just the evidential worth.
Okay. Yes.
thoughts.
I do
Yeah.
like this better. Yeah. So I'm wondering if it might actually be the phenomenon, sort of like, it's not just about what you reject, but it's
Mhm.
also what you overinflate. So there's a way in which, if we're thinking about Fitzgerald's perspective, maybe he's like hyper aware of ways in which he perceives, like conservative white men,
Mhm.
not having a certain advantages in academic context, combined with a failure to like give the proper weight
Yeah.
to some of the points that Kennedy makes. So for example, the history.
Mhm.
So maybe it's a combination of overinflating certain things while simultaneously rejecting certain things.
Or maybe the overinflating motivates the rejection.
Yeah, they can be working together. Particularly, I think the coherence model actually fits really well for
Yeah.
that kind of take. Yeah, so if you've overinflated,
Yeah.
if we're thinking about the model of a web, right?
Yeah.
If something's too far in the center of the
Mhm,
web, it's going to push out other things.
Right.
And maybe part of why maybe part of what leads to the rejection, in fact, is the overinflation of certain beliefs or perspectives and vice
Yeah.
versa. So I'm just
No,
looking here.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mhm.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm one of Mark's new colleagues in law school, but I just want to take a second to contextualize the Fitzgerald Kennedy debate
Yes.
in a way, because I think that
Thank you.
they and we are using the word diversity in two different senses that has the potential to lead us astray if we're not careful about it. Because The background for this is the Bakke case way back in the day, where the Supreme Court first considers university admissions affirmative action programs. And they consider UC Davis Medical School's program, and UC Davis Medical School offers a lot of potential rationales for why it thinks affirmative action is good, given the achievement gap that they're seeing. So one of them might be to, combat past societal discrimination, or to provide better role models in the medical profession for people of color, and so on. And basically, the message coming out of the fractured set of Supreme Court opinions in that case is that none of those count. No, UC Davis, you can't enact affirmative action reasons for any of those reasons. The only reason for which you can enact an affirmative action program is because you believe that that diversity will enhance the educational experience for your white students, basically, which is deeply problematic, but that's a whole nother story. What that led to is a regime where universities, who are not stupid, enact affirmative action programs, and they say, we're doing this to enhance the educational experience because that's what diversity does. The reason I'm bringing this up is because in large part, when Fitzgerald says diversity is a sham, he's not saying that universities aren't sincerely committed to DEI. What he's saying is that universities are being disingenuous when they say this is merely about how diversity enhances the educational experience, as opposed to all those other reasons why we might think that DEI is valuable in the university context, which he says are illegitimate. And that's why Kennedy agrees. Kennedy says, yes, I agree. Universities are being disingenuous when they say this is merely about the classroom experience, and now all the other reasons why someone committed to social justice would in fact want an affirmative action program. So in that sense, I'm not sure. Well, that gets us back to our question, which is, is Fitzgerald dismissing the evidentiary value of the achievement gap? And I'm not sure that the point he's making even directly goes to that, because most of his speech isn't about what the achievement gap tells us, as it is making the argument that law schools are seeking social engineering rather than in classroom experience enhancement, which again, Kennedy agrees with, although Kennedy thinks that social engineering is desirable and Fitzgerald thinks that it's undesirable. So that's all.
Oh, good. That's exactly it, right? Yes. So coming back to sort of my reading into Fitzgerald and the sort of background argument that's going on, that I perceive is going on, the end point is that what we have is fine, right?
Right.
America is great. We don't need to mess around with it. And that, but Kennedy is saying, well, no, like we still have work to do. We still have some repairs to make. We still, right? And I think that, actually, I don't know what I think about that just yet. Yeah, but that's exactly right. Yeah.
Elena and then Aaron.
I just have a curiosity about the categories that you list there: thoughts, memories, perceptions, beliefs, testimonies, but not facts or histories. So when you're rejecting or overinflating certain kinds of evidence, I'm curious about then how the evidentiary, you talked about sort of personal positioning and experiential positioning. But since this is so frequently characterized as an era where facts are contested, I'm just wondering about that construction of that particular list and the omission of certain of the contested categories that are.
So good. That's gonna be a chapter.
Okay.
So there are two, well, there's several views of truth, but so a rival view of truth to coherentism is the correspondence theory of truth. So the correspondence theory says, here's a statement. Today is Monday. By virtue of what is that statement true? By virtue of the meaning of that statement and how well it corresponds with the facts of the world, right? Coherentists don't care about the facts. Well, I have to be careful. Small just right here. I can't be fast and loose with my definitions.
You can be fast enough and loosen up for fast.
There are coherentists who are weak foundationalists, but so the truth of a statement for coherentists is really based upon how it coheres with your web of beliefs, right? And how well your beliefs cohere, depends on how their relation to one another and there's sort of the logical connections between them. But it's not really interested, if I can be, I'll just say, it's not really interested in how well it fits with how the world really is. Whether there really is a world outside of our minds is not relevant for coherentists.
So that's a closed system.
It's a closed system.
Wow.
That's why it's so dangerous when paired with standpoint. So maximally coherentist and maximally standpoint together, right? Makes for a witch's brew. And I think that's a lot of what's happening. Right? So that's why it's individual centered. And then it gets really, okay, we'll stop.
I was gonna ask about circularity and his position. Would Fitzgerald argue that his position, would he argue that we aren't social engineering by maintaining the so-called meritocracy in which he is a proponent of? I mean, would he have?
Well, everybody's invited to the party. Right? Everybody's invited. And we had the civil rights movement in the 60s. We made changes to our laws. We created institutions and structures that make it possible for, and I'm sort of putting myself in his shoes, right? But make it possible for people we've given them the bootstraps. Now it's up to them. And everybody's invited. Nobody's going to be formally excluded. What do you think?
So I'm just trying to wrap my head around whether or not his argument is would he, what you just said about coherence and correspondence to reality helped a little bit, but he would deny the fact that he would be having a circular argument, right?
Surely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm not sure whether he is giving a circular argument. Is he giving a circular argument? Let me see that.
He would at some point want to employ some neutral fact on which he's pursuing his argument. So if that's the case, then no, he wouldn't suggest he's making a circular argument.
Yeah.
Because once that is done for analytic theories, that's when you kind of concede your intellectual terrain, right?
So I think that Fitzgerald has a pretty coherent system going, right? So he can include, if someone were to press him and say, which Kennedy does, by the way, earlier, if someone were to press him and say, if not affirmative action, and if not formal DEI programs, then what? Right? If you agree that there are these achievement gaps and you agree that there are these injustices that have occurred that can, that have, negatively impacted African-American communities and we continue to see the effects of them, what do you suggest? Right? And he doesn't come to the table and say what he suggests, but it's sort of operating in the background, right? Bonilla Silva talks about this in terms of the laissez-faire, understanding of society, that of our economy, and that everybody's free. Everybody's free to pursue their idea of the good life, and we have the institutions and the structures and legal systems in place for people to pursue their idea of the good life. The implication of that is that if that's all that's needed, if that's sufficient for people to be successful, then, right? Then if they're not, then that implies that there's cultural issues, right? That there are certain people who don't value education, who would rather just all these stupid, right, conclusions. That why is there racial segregation? People are free to move. They can move wherever they want. We live in a laissez-faire society, economy. Everybody can move wherever they want. If they're not, what does it mean? It must mean that they want to live where they are. Yes.
I'm not a philosopher, but hearing from what I've heard, it seems that one of the things that he mentioned, the obvious thing that hit me is one's white, one's black. And that background isn't even discussed, which is ironic considering they're talking about colorblindness, but that's another story. But the thing that got me, that he made the example that conservative values are not taken into consideration,
Right.
which told me that, so if you view ideology as the only really important thing, if you ignore all these other things,
Right.
and he's just saying that ideology is what really matters. So, but with that idea, you can be as prejudiced as you want, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Everything can just go. And it seems like that kind of an argument is saying it doesn't really matter. We don't really care. We have these deficiencies and problems with other people, but it doesn't really matter because I'm not really considered.
Yeah.
That's how I take it. So I just thought that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, things, ideas and views reign supreme. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, what do we do about this? You know, what is do you have any?
Oh, I have a solution.
Do you have an antidote?
I have a solution. Stand up for this.
No, I would love to, I would love to hear your thoughts on how we, you know, how do we counter this? Is epistemic humility what we need? Because that phrase, I love it. I don't know more about it. But yeah, what do we do? And how do we prevent ourselves from, you know, participating in this?
So what I'm about to say is gonna be a wah-wah. But I read this beautiful article. It was written in the 1980s. It's written by a Latina and I guess white European American philosopher. And they co-wrote this article about this gap in understanding that exists because of our standpoints, that exists, you know, no matter what, it's there. And so I made this distinction between understanding and knowledge. And what these two philosophers, Ligones and Spellman, I believe, Spellman, yes. What they argue is for friendship. Now, their idea of friendship is not the, oh, chummy, you know, let's go for coffee friendship, but it's a friendship based on common needs. Like we live in a, you know, we live in society, we live together, we live in community, we're social beings. We need each other. At one point when I was crafting this talk, I thought I would bring, I thought I'd bring Simone de Beauvoir into it and talk about how our freedom is dependent on, you know, maximizing the freedom of others, but that's the case too. You know, sort of seeing how we are not merely individual moral agents, but that we are, our identity is necessarily entwined with others. And so, you know, moving away from the ideological discourses and moving towards discourses based on humanity. And I think we're more inclined to that. I think that when we engage in discourse, we're inclined to engage in our common humanity. But, you know, but politics gets in the way. So friendship, I think, centering friendship and humanity is the way to bridge the gap.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is the stance centering humanity a political stance? Because if it is, that suggests we can bridge the gap with those who share our politics to the extent that they're willing to center humanity and not with those who don't.
The Constitution is, after all. Right? I mean, I'm no lawyer. But isn't that the Constitution after all? Isn't that, you know, the United Nations Charter of Human Rights? Human rights. Yeah, I agree.
Can I just ask one other follow-up question related to yours, Jamie, about what this looks like in the Better Arguments project? How do you get people to speak to one another across these divides and hear one another in the work that you do with the Civil
Discourse Initiative?
Mm-hmm.
So it gets more complicated. Like this is all theorizing, right? And modeling and, you know, in a way it's simpler. Human interaction is more dynamic, but the principles are the same. So the centering of humanity creates a bridge between people. But we live in a society where there are embedded inequalities. We exist in spaces where, you know, there are power differentials and differences. There's a, you know, a principle in the Better Arguments Project that sort of asks participants to make room for transformation and to pay attention to context. But if you're, if you're in discussion with your boss, or you're in an abusive relationship, or if you're, and I don't mean to equate the two, only your relationship with your boss is healthy. But if if there's this power differential, or you disagree at a visceral level with someone, but you don't feel safe in, paying attention to context and, making room for transformation. Those dynamics sort of temper these principles of better arguments. It's not in every case where we can be generous. And understanding those limitations, I think, is also an integral part of having constructive discourse, knowing when to pull away, knowing when to engage, knowing when you're engaging, how, what's at stake for you, what's at stake for the other person. So all of these things we talk about in the civil discourse. We should shame this product. But yeah, the principles seem to have a certain bias to them. They assume an equal playing field, which is fine. You have to start somewhere. But then factoring in all of the variations sort of modifies and tempers those principles in different contexts.
Could you check and make sure we didn't have any questions in the chat? And before we wrap up, I just want to make sure that, nope, they're good. All right, well, I see that we're at time. So I would like to thank Layla for this wonderful talk and invite people to ask her additional follow-up questions informally. Thank you all for being here.